Doctor stood in the observation chamber. 6 of their crystalline sensory stalks focused on the data streams flowing across the displays. The numbers made no sense. 3 months had passed since the disaster, and by every model the Galactic Therapeutic Consortium had developed over of studying grief, humanity should be paralyzed. They weren't. Assistant, a young named, chittered nervously beside them. The stress hormones are still elevated, said, their antennae twitching with confusion. Cortisol levels indicate severe ongoing trauma, sleep disruption across 73% of our sample group. Immune system markers show persistent distress. By every physical measure, these humans are suffering catastrophic grief. And yet, prompted, already knowing what would say. And yet they've launched 17 major initiatives since the disaster, memorial projects, research foundations, new safety protocols, support networks, a complete redesign of their early warning systems. His vocal sac inflated with frustration. It doesn't follow any known pattern. They should be in collective paralysis. They should be processing the loss through their cultural frameworks before resuming normal function. Instead, they're doing both simultaneously. How? Had asked themselves the same question every day since arriving on Earth. This own grief processing was elegant, efficient. When lost their bonded partner 3 decades ago, the memory had crystallized perfectly in their neural lattice. The pain had served its purpose, teaching to avoid the specific circumstances that led to the loss, and then it had gradually become inert. Could access the memory without suffering. It was the way grief should work. But humans didn't work that way. The colony ship disaster had killed 12,000 people. The vessel had encountered a cosmic anomaly, a spatial distortion that appeared without warning and crushed the ship like an insect. There was no one to blame, no lesson to extract, no evolutionary advantage to the suffering. It was the kind of purposeless tragedy that broke civilizations. Had studied 47 species that experienced similar disasters. The pattern was always the same. First came shock, then collective mourning, then a slow, painful return to baseline function. Some species took years, some took generations, but they all followed the curve. Except humans. Show me the 5 primary subjects again, said. The displays shifted. 5 human faces appeared, along with their biographical data and current activity logs. Sarah, age 42, lost her daughter in the disaster, currently leading the primary memorial project, working 16-hour days coordinating with artists, architects, and bereaved families across 3 continents. Her physiological readings showed someone in acute distress. Her productivity showed someone operating at peak efficiency. Age 37, lost his husband Daniel, engineer, currently heading the redesign of humanity's deep space early warning network, sleeping 4 hours a night, stress markers through the ceiling, somehow managing a team of 200 people and making breakthrough progress on detection algorithms. Age 23, survivor, pulled from the escape pod with 63 others while thousands died, consumed by guilt, currently writing a book about the experience, documenting every horrible thought, every moment of shame. The book was already being called brutally honest. Publishers were fighting over it. Dr. Elizabeth Hann, age 51, lost her younger brother. Therapist, now pioneering new grief counseling methods based on her own shattered experience. Her client list had tripled. Her methods were spreading through the psychological community like wildfire. James, age 46, composer, lost his sister and her entire family, currently working on a requiem for the dead. Early performances had reduced audiences to tears. Critics were calling it the most powerful piece of music composed in decades. They're all breaking, observed. Look at the data. They're physically and emotionally devastated. Yes, said slowly, but they're not stopping. That was the anomaly. That was what made no sense. Every other species had studied showed an inverse relationship between grief intensity and functional capacity. The more you hurt, the less you could do. It was a universal constant. Humans seemed to violate that law. Had requested permission from each of the 5 subjects to observe them more closely. All had agreed, though Sarah had looked at with red-rimmed eyes and said, "I don't know what you think you'll find. We're just trying to survive this." But that wasn't what they were doing. Had observed enough species to know what survival looked like. This was something else. The first deep observation session was with Sarah at the memorial site. She stood in what would become the central chamber, surrounded by holographic mock-ups and architectural diagrams. Her hands shook as she manipulated the displays. "Loved stars," Sarah said, her voice cracking. She used to map constellations on her bedroom ceiling, so the memorial needs to incorporate stellar mapping. Every person we lost gets their own star coordinate. When you stand in the center, you're surrounded by them. Watched the tremor in Sarah's hands, the moisture gathering in her eyes, the way her breathing hitched. "You are in significant pain," observed. It wasn't a question. "Every second of every day," Sarah confirmed. She didn't stop working. Her fingers continued to adjust the hologram, refining the placement of each stellar marker. "Some days I can barely get out of bed. Some days I forget she's gone for a moment, and then I remember, and it feels like dying. Yet you continue this work." Sarah looked at directly. "What else would I do? Sit still? Let the pain just exist without purpose?" She shook her head. "Was real, she lived, she mattered. If I do nothing, then her death is just random violence in an uncaring universe. But if I build this, if I create something beautiful enough to hold all of our grief, then her death means something. She means something. The pain has to go somewhere. I'm giving it somewhere to live." Sensory stalks quivered. "Among my people, grief crystallizes and becomes inert once its evolutionary purpose is served. The pain fades because it no longer serves function." "That sounds nice," Sarah said. "I don't think that's possible for us, or maybe we just don't want it to be." She returned to her work, tears streaming down her face, hands steady despite the shaking. "The pain is proof of love. If I let it fade, I let her fade, so I carry it, and I carry her, and I build something beautiful enough to hold both." The session with was equally confounding. The engineer sat surrounded by displays showing spatial distortion patterns, probability matrices, and sensor network designs. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight. His body was running on stimulants and stubbornness. "The distortion that killed them had a signature," explained, his voice hoarse. "Faint, but it was there. If we'd had better sensors, better prediction algorithms, we might have seen it coming, might have rooted them around it." He rubbed his eyes. "Daniel's last message to me was make sure they're safe." He was talking about the other colonists, the people in his section. "But I'm making it bigger than that. I'm making sure everyone's safe. Every ship, every crew, every family." "You blame yourself," said. "I blame the universe for being random and cruel. I blame the limitations of our technology. I blame the fact that we send people into space without perfect information." His jaw tightened. "But blame doesn't build sensor networks. Grief does. Rage does. Love does. Every time I want to give up, I hear his voice. Make sure they're safe. So I make sure they're safe." "Does the pain diminish as you work?" Laughed, but there was no humor in it. "No, it gets worse, because the work reminds me why I'm doing it. Every calculation is for Daniel. Every sensor I design is so no one else loses their Daniel. The pain is fuel. It has to be. Otherwise, what's it for?" Sat in a small apartment surrounded by papers and recording equipment. Her eyes were haunted. "You want to know why I'm writing this book?" she said before could ask. "Everyone asks. They say it's too soon. They say I should heal first." "Why do you write it?" asked. "Because I got to live and they didn't, and that's not fair, and I hate myself for surviving, and I know that's irrational, but I feel it anyway." The words tumbled out. "And somewhere out there, someone else is feeling this exact thing. Someone else is drowning in survivor's guilt, and they think they're alone. They think they're broken. I need them to know they're not alone. I need them to know this is survivable. You are using your pain to help others." "I'm weaponizing my shame," corrected. I'm taking the worst parts of myself and putting them on display so someone else can feel less alone. It doesn't make the guilt go away, but it makes it useful. Dr. Elizabeth Han explained her new methods with clinical precision, even as tears ran down her face. Traditional grief counseling tries to help people reach acceptance, closure, moving on. But that's not how it works for us. We don't move on. We move forward carrying everything with us. The distinction matters. Everything matters, Elizabeth said fiercely. My brother is dead. That's a fact I carry now. It will never not be true, but I get to decide what I do with that truth. I can let it crush me, or I can use it to understand pain in ways I never could before. I can sit with my clients in their darkest moments and say, honestly, I know this territory. I'm walking it right now. Let me show you it's walkable. James, the composer, sat at his piano. His hands moved across the keys, drawing out a melody that made sensory stalks ache with its beauty and sorrow. The Requiem isn't about closure, James said, still playing. It's about giving the grief somewhere to live. Music can hold things words can't. Pain, love, loss, hope, all at the same time. The melody shifted, became something almost uplifting before falling back into sorrow. I still cry every time I play this. Every single time. That's not a failure. That's the point. The music holds the pain so we don't have to carry it alone. Compiled their preliminary observations and transmitted them to the consortium. The response came back within hours. Data rejected. Observations indicate impossible sustained grief function dynamic. Recommend extended observation. Subjects will collapse under maintained stress load. Wait for breakdown before final analysis. But was beginning to suspect something that terrified them. They watched Sarah place another star coordinate, watched refine another algorithm, watched write another brutal chapter, watched Elizabeth hand comfort another grieving client, watched James compose another movement. They were all breaking, they were all building. And they weren't going to stop. What if there was no breaking point? What if humans had learned to run on grief itself, using pain as fuel instead of letting it be a burden? What if humanity's greatest weakness was actually their most terrible strength? Didn't know, but they were going to find out. 6 months after the disaster, his team was fracturing. The data had become impossible to reconcile with any known model of grief processing. Had requested reassignment 3 times. It's not sustainable, they insisted, their antennae flat against their head in distress. No species can maintain this level of cortisol, this degree of sleep deprivation, this intensity of emotional distress without systemic collapse. It violates basic biology. And yet they haven't collapsed, said quietly. The third member of their research team, unnamed, had taken to avoiding the observation chambers entirely. The processed grief through chemical cascades that naturally degraded after serving their evolutionary purpose. Watching humans refuse to let their pain degrade was causing something close to existential horror. They're poisoning themselves, had said during the last team meeting. They're choosing to remain in a state of suffering. It's not adaptation, it's self-destruction. But was it? Had been watching the 5 subjects for months now, and while they were clearly suffering, they weren't destroying themselves. They were transforming. Sarah's memorial project had evolved beyond anything had seen in their 2 centuries of research. The structure wasn't just beautiful. It was alive with meaning. Every surface told a story. Every light represented a life. And Sarah herself had become something more than she was before the disaster. Not healed, not whole, but deeper, stronger, forged by the pain she refused to set down. Had asked her about it during one observation session. You work 16 hours a day. You barely sleep. Your physiological markers indicate chronic stress, yet you describe this as fulfilling work. Sarah had smiled, though her eyes were still sad. I'm exhausted, I'm heartbroken, and this is the best work I've ever done in my life. She gestured to the memorial taking shape around them. Before the disaster, I was an architect. I designed buildings. They were fine, functional, sometimes even pretty, but they didn't mean anything, not really. She touched one of the stellar markers, her daughter's coordinate. Now everything means something. Every choice I make is an act of love. Every design decision is a way to honor not just but all of them. The pain makes me careful. It makes me deliberate. It makes me remember that this matters. They matter. You could step back, suggested. Let others finish the work, rest. I could, Sarah agreed. But then what? Sit with my grief in silence. Let it eat me from the inside. At least this way, the pain is building something. At least this way, death isn't just a random tragedy. It's the foundation of something beautiful. Had made similar comments when questioned his relentless work schedule. The early warning network was nearly complete. It was a marvel of engineering, incorporating technologies and approaches that hadn't existed before the disaster, had driven his team to innovation through sheer force of determined will. I know what you're thinking, said, not looking up from his calculations. You're thinking I'm running from the grief, that I'm burying myself in work to avoid feeling it. That was my initial hypothesis, admitted. You're wrong. Finally looked up and his eyes were red-rimmed but fierce. I feel every second of it. I wake up every morning reaching for Daniel, and every morning I remember he's gone. It's like drowning, every single day. Then why continue at this pace? Because the drowning is the point. Stood, began packing. The pain is what reminds me why this matters. The grief is what keeps me honest. Every time I think about taking shortcuts, about doing the minimum, I remember Daniel's last words. Make sure they're safe. The pain is what makes sure I don't forget. The pain is what makes sure I do this right. He pulled up a simulation showing the network in action, predicting and routing around spatial distortions. This network will save lives, hundreds, thousands, maybe more. And every life it saves is Daniel's legacy. Every family that stays together is because I didn't let the pain stop me. I let it drive me instead. Had begun to understand the mechanism, but understanding it didn't make it less alien. The approach was so different. When lost their bonded partner, the grief had been acute but temporary. The memory crystallized, became data, became lesson, became inert. Could remember the love without feeling the loss. It was merciful. But humans had no mercy for themselves. His book was nearing completion, had been granted access to the drafts, and reading them was like staring into an abyss of human emotion. Held nothing back. Every shameful thought, every moment of guilt, every instance of wishing others had survived instead of her. It was raw and terrible and achingly honest. Why expose yourself this way? Asked during an observation session. Looked up from her writing, her face gaunt from months of reliving trauma. Because someone needs to. Because survivor's guilt is real and horrible, and it makes you think things you'd never say out loud. And because somewhere, someone else is thinking the same things, and they need to know they're not a monster. You are causing yourself pain by documenting this. I'm already in pain, corrected. I'm just putting it somewhere useful. Every chapter I write is another person who might read it and realize they're not alone. Every horrible thought I confess is permission for someone else to have horrible thoughts without hating themselves for it. She saved her work, closed the document. The guilt isn't going away, it's never going away. I got to live and they didn't, and that's a fact I'll carry until I die. But if I carry it in silence, it's just weight. If I carry it publicly, it becomes a bridge. Other people can walk across it. They can use my pain to find their way through their own. This is not healing, observed. By clinical definitions, this is maintained trauma. You're right, said. It's not healing, it's something else. It's transforming trauma into connection. It's taking poison and making it into medicine. Does it hurt? Every day, but it helps, and helping makes the hurting bearable. Dr. Elizabeth Hahn had articulated the mechanism most clearly. As a therapist, she had the vocabulary to explain what she was doing, even as she was doing it to herself. Traditional grief models assume the goal is resolution, Elizabeth explained during one of his visits. You move through stages, you reach acceptance, you achieve closure, you move on. She shook her head. But that's not how human grief actually works. We don't move on, we integrate. The distinction, asked. Moving on implies leaving the pain behind. Integration means absorbing it, letting it become part of who you are. Elizabeth pulled up case files, showing treatment outcomes. My clients who try to move on, who try to get back to who they were before their loss, they struggle. They feel guilty for laughing. They feel like they're betraying the dead by living. She switched to different files. But my clients who integrate, who accept that they're fundamentally changed by their loss, who let the grief become part of their identity instead of something to overcome, they function better. They hurt just as much, but they hurt while living. You are teaching people to maintain their pain. I'm teaching people to make their pain meaningful, Elizabeth corrected. My brother died. That's a truth I carry now. It changed me. I'm not the same person I was before, and that's okay. I'm not trying to get back to who I was. I'm trying to become who I am now, which is someone who loves deeply enough to grieve deeply, and who uses that grief to understand suffering in ways I never could before. She looked at directly. You want to know the secret. The pain is proof of love. If I let the pain fade, I'm letting the love fade. Humans don't want that. We'd rather hurt forever than diminish what we felt. James' Requiem had premiered to a packed concert hall, had attended, curious to observe human responses to formalized grief expression. What they witnessed had shaken them to their crystalline core. The music was devastatingly beautiful. It moved through movements that captured shock, despair, rage, sorrow, and something that wasn't quite hope but wasn't quite despair either. It was the sound of carrying on while broken, the sound of building while grieving, the sound of transformation through pain. The audience wept openly, not polite tears but raw sobbing, and James, conducting his own composition, wept with them. His hands never faltered. The music never stopped. He cried and conducted simultaneously, the pain and the purpose existing together. After the performance, as the audience gave a standing ovation that lasted nearly half an hour, had asked James why he continued to perform the piece if it caused him such distress. Because it needs to be felt, James said simply. His face was streaked with tears, but he was smiling. The Requiem isn't for the dead. They don't need it, it's for us. It's a container for grief. It holds the pain so we don't have to carry it alone. Every time I conduct it, I'm sharing the burden. Every person in that audience, they brought their own losses. The music gave them permission to feel it together. You could have written something less painful, suggested. I could have, but that wouldn't be honest. The disaster was painful. Losing my sister was devastating. The music has to be true to that. If I softened it, made it easier to digest, I'd be lying. And lying about grief doesn't help anyone. He started packing up his scores. The pain is the point. The pain is what makes the beauty mean something. If I wrote happy music about tragedy, it would be empty. But this hurts because it's true. And truth, even when it hurts, is what people need. Compiled their updated findings and transmitted them to the consortium. This time, the report was more detailed, more insistent. Human grief processing shows sustained high-intensity emotional distress paired with unprecedented functional capacity. Subjects maintain acute suffering while simultaneously engaging in complex creative, social, and technical work. The mechanism appears to be deliberate transformation of pain into purposeful action. The pain is not reduced. It is utilized as motivational fuel. The consortium's response was predictable. Observations remain inconsistent with established grief processing models. Recommend continued observation. Breakdown is inevitable under sustained distress load. But knew better now. 3 more months of observation had made it clear. The breakdown wasn't coming. The humans weren't going to collapse. They were going to keep hurting, keep building, keep transforming their agony into something that mattered. Thought about their own bonded partner, dead 3 decades, crystallized into inert memory. They could access the information without feeling the loss. It was efficient. It was healthy by every measure. But it was also done. The grief had served its purpose and faded. The love had become historical fact. It no longer hurt, but it also no longer drove anything. It was past. Humans refused to make their grief past tense. They dragged it into the present, let it fuel everything they did, let it transform them into something more than they were before. It was costly. It was painful. It was also undeniably powerful. Sarah's memorial would stand for centuries. His early warning network would save countless lives. His book would help thousands of survivors. Elizabeth Hand's methods would reshape grief counseling. James' requiem would move millions. All of it built on unresolved, sustained, deliberate pain. All of it powered by grief that refused to fade. Stood in the observation chamber, watching the 5 subjects continue their work, and wondered if efficiency was really the goal. The way was cleaner. The way was easier. The way was kinder. But the human way, painful as it was, built things that lasted. The pain was the foundation. The grief was the fuel. The transformation was the point. Was beginning to understand, and understanding terrified them. 1 year after the disaster, submitted their final report to the Galactic Therapeutic Consortium. The data was comprehensive, the observations meticulous, and the conclusions were going to cause an uproar. The 5 primary subjects had not broken. If anything, they had become stronger, though not in any way the consortium would recognize as healthy. Sarah's memorial had opened to the public 3 months prior. It had become more than a monument. It had become a pilgrimage site. People traveled from across Earth and the colonies to stand in the stellar chamber, surrounded by 12,000 points of light, each one a life lost. They came to grieve, and they came to be reminded that grief could be beautiful. Sarah herself looked older than she had a year ago. The lines around her eyes had deepened. Her hair had gone significantly grayer, but there was something in her bearing that hadn't been there before the disaster. A solidity, a purpose. She moved through the memorial like a priest tending a sacred space, because that's what it had become. Sacred not to any god, but to the act of remembering. "I still miss her every day," Sarah had told during their final interview. "I still wake up thinking I need to call her. I still see something beautiful and want to share it with her. The pain hasn't diminished at all." "Then what has changed?" asked. Sarah smiled, and it was a sad smile but also genuine. "The pain has a home now. It lives here in this memorial. When people come here to grieve, they're not alone in their grief. Loss isn't just mine anymore. It's part of something larger. The pain is still mine, but the meaning belongs to everyone." She touched a stellar marker gently. "I've fallen in love again. I didn't think I could. I thought loving someone new would be betraying's memory. But I've learned that love doesn't replace love, it compounds. My new partner understands that is still present, still honored, still loved. The grief and the joy exist together now. I don't have to choose." This early warning network had already proven its worth. 2 months prior, it had detected a spatial distortion forming in a heavily trafficked shipping lane. Dozens of vessels had been rerouted, potentially thousands of lives saved, had received commendations from every major spacefaring nation. He donated every award to the Memorial Fund. Daniel would have liked that, said when asked about the donations. He never cared about recognition. He cared about people being safe. Looked exhausted but content. "The network is operational now. It's working. Every ship that makes it home, every family that stays together, that's Daniel's legacy. That's what his death bought. It's not fair. It's not right, but it's something." Had asked the question they'd been building toward all year. Does the grief ever become easier? "No," said bluntly. "It never gets easier, but it becomes part of the rhythm. Wake up, miss him. Remember why the work matters, do the work, go to sleep, do it again. The pain is constant, but so is the purpose. They balance each other." He'd started dating someone new, told, another engineer. Someone who understood that late-night work sessions were sometimes about the algorithms and sometimes about not wanting to go home to an empty apartment. Someone who knew Daniel's name and didn't flinch when mentioned him. The grief doesn't go away when you love again, explained. But it makes room. Somehow there's space for both. His book had become a phenomenon. Publishers had been right to fight over it. The raw honesty, the unflinching documentation of survivors' guilt, had resonated with people experiencing all kinds of trauma, had become an unexpected advocate for mental health, speaking at conferences, mentoring other survivors, and always being honest about how much it still hurt. People think publication would be cathartic, told, that getting it all out would somehow make it better, but it doesn't. I still feel guilty. I still wonder why I survived. Writing about it didn't fix anything. Then why continue? Asked. You've completed the book, you could stop now. Because the work isn't done, said firmly. The book is out there now and people are reading it and they're reaching out to tell me it helped. Some of them are survivors like me. Some lost people in the disaster. Some experienced completely different traumas but recognized the emotions. Every person who says the book helped them, that's my guilt doing something useful. That's my survival meaning something. She pulled up messages on her device, hundreds of them, all from readers. I'm still drowning in guilt most days, but now when I drown, I can throw a rope to someone else who's drowning too. We sink together, but at least we're not alone. Dr. Elizabeth Hand's new grief counseling methods had spread through the psychological community like wildfire. Her approach, integration-focused rather than resolution-focused, was producing outcomes that challenged decades of established practice. Her clients weren't moving on. They were moving forward, carrying their losses with them, learning to live while grieving rather than waiting to grieve before living. The traditional model assumes grief is something to overcome, Elizabeth explained during final observation. But that's not how it works for us. We don't overcome the loss of people we love. We absorb it. We let it change us. We become people who have experienced loss, and we let that inform everything we do. She showed success metrics, client testimonials, follow-up studies. My clients hurt just as much as clients using traditional methods. Maybe more because they're not trying to minimize the pain, but they function better. They form connections more easily. They report higher life satisfaction. The pain and the satisfaction exist together. That's the key insight. They're not opposite ends of a spectrum. They're two things that can coexist. Elizabeth had started dating again too, a widower she'd met through her grief counseling network. We talk about our losses on our dates, she said with a small laugh. Most people would think that's morbid, but for us, it's honest. We're both carrying people we loved. We're not trying to replace them. We're just learning to love again while still loving them. It's complicated, but it's real. James' Requiem had been performed in 17 countries and recorded by 3 major symphonies. Each performance reduced audiences to tears. Each performance left them somehow uplifted despite the sorrow. James conducted every performance he could attend, and he wept through every single one. People ask me when it will get easier, James told, when I'll be able to conduct the Requiem without crying, and I tell them never, I hope never. He sat at his piano, the same piano where he'd composed the piece, and played a few bars of the main theme. The tears are part of the performance. The grief is part of the music. If I could conduct it without feeling it, the audience would know. They'd feel the dishonesty. He'd started working on a new piece. Not a requiem this time, but a symphony, about hope and grief existing together, about building while broken, about carrying loss and finding joy anyway. The grief opened something in me, James explained. I wrote music before the disaster, but it was technically proficient and emotionally hollow. Now everything I write has depth because I have depth. The pain gave me that. I wouldn't wish this on anyone, but I also can't deny that it transformed my art. Compiled all of this into their final report. They included physiological data showing that all 5 subjects still exhibited markers of acute distress. Cortisol levels remained elevated. Sleep architecture was still disrupted. By every clinical measure, these humans were still suffering. But alongside the suffering data included the other metrics: the lives saved by S network, the people helped by S book, the clients successfully treated using Elizabeth's methods, the cultural impact of James's requiem, the thousands who found solace in Sarah's memorial. The report's conclusion was stark. Human grief processing represents a fundamental departure from all known models. Where other species seek to reduce suffering, humans transform it. They do not overcome grief. They weaponize it. They turn pain into fuel, loss into motivation, and suffering into purpose. This is biologically costly. It maintains chronic stress, disrupts normal function, and causes sustained distress. Yet it also produces unprecedented creative, social, and technical output. Continued, the mechanism appears to be a conscious choice to link suffering to meaningful action. Humans create a psychological framework where the pain serves as evidence of love, and maintaining the pain becomes a way of honoring the lost. They refuse to allow their grief to become inert. Instead, they keep it active, present, and purposeful. This allows them to access the motivational energy of acute grief while simultaneously engaging in complex, long-term projects. The report included comparisons to other species. The crystallization model, where grief served its purpose and faded. The dilution model, where suffering was distributed across the hive until it became negligible. The degradation model, where chemical signals naturally declined after their function was complete. Every other known species has an off switch for grief, wrote. Humans do not. Or rather, they have one and refuse to use it. This is not a failure of their psychology. It is a feature. The sustained grief is intentional. The ongoing pain is the point. Added a section on outcomes that would alarm the consortium. They had traced human history, looking for this pattern in other contexts. They found it everywhere. Medical researchers driven by the loss of loved ones, civil rights activists motivated by personal experiences of injustice, artists creating their greatest works from their deepest traumas, advocates for peace who had experienced war, safety innovations born from tragedy. Every major human advancement we can trace has this signature, reported. Humans who experienced loss maintained the pain of that loss and channeled it into creating something that would prevent or alleviate similar losses for others. They do not heal and then help. They help while hurting. The pain drives the helping. The implications section was where knew they would lose the consortium. This mechanism makes humans simultaneously fragile and resilient. Fragile because they maintain chronic distress. Resilient because that distress fuels their forward motion. They can be shattered and still function, broken and still build, grieving and still create. This is not a bug in their psychology. It is their most powerful adaptation. Included personal observations, knowing this violated protocol but not caring. I have studied grief across hundreds of species for 2 centuries. I have never encountered a species that grieves like humans. They grieve the way they love, completely and without reservation. They refuse to protect themselves from the cost of caring. They would rather shatter and rebuild repeatedly than numb themselves to loss. The report concluded with a warning. If you wish to understand humanity's capacity for innovation, art, justice, compassion, and relentless forward motion, you must first understand this. They are a species that runs on grief, not away from it, on it, as fuel. This makes them dangerous and creative and